Thank you, Chairman. I share Senator Corker's frustrations with where we are, and I think you, Mr. Chairman, have expressed similar frustrations. We have a ridiculous budget process, and as a result of that, we end up with ridiculous budgets. This budget is going no place. We all know that. It was cooked up in the laboratories of the Koch brothers and a bunch of other creepy billionaires who want to remake America in Ayn Rand's image. It is cooked up in the laboratories of polluters who want absolutely no regulation so they can despoil at will. It includes over $1 trillion in Medicaid cuts that are clearly going no place. It is completely out of step with the funding bill that the president just signed and touted. It's off by $58 billion just from the non-defense discretionary part of the funding bill that the president just signed. It knocks down HHS with a 21% cut, as opposed to the funding bill that we just passed, which has $6 billion in opioid fundings that I think Americans desperately need. The funding bill we just passed added $20 billion in infrastructure-related investments. This cuts it by $40 billion for a $60 billion delta going the wrong way on infrastructure. And part of the reason that these silly things are in here is because the process is so silly. It is completely partisan, which is why it ends up cooked up in extremist laboratories, and it's unrelated to the funding process because of its failures. We have a budget process over here that ends up producing nothing, and then we have a funding process that's led by leadership and the appropriators that ends up actually doing the work of putting the funding measures of government together. And there's virtually no relationship between the two. The budget is like a firework that goes off with a big bang, and everybody pays attention to it because it's noisy and bright, and it has zero effect on the people who actually make the decisions year in and year out on funding the government. And I think it's a shame. And I think the signals that this is wrong are, first of all, that there's no bipartisanship whatsoever. That's been a problem for a long time. It's a vehicle for one party to express its political persuasion, to express its loyalty to its big funders, and to create a path for another purely partisan vote using the reconciliation measure. That's basically all it accomplishes. A budget process that worked would also look at tax expenditures. More money goes out the back door of the tax code than gets spent through most of these appropriations, and yet we don't look at that. The healthcare expenditure of the country, of the federal government, in the 10-year out period has been estimated to have fallen by about $3 trillion. That's a big number, and we don't know why. I think it has something to do with ACOs and with payment reform and with changes in treatment by doctors at the local level that are actually driving down per patient year-over-year costs, but we don't know that. We ought to be vitally interested in trying to figure out why we got that $3 trillion and how we can make more of it if we're getting it by better patient care. My God, what could be more important than improving patient care and lowering costs at the same time instead of going after preposterous cuts? We have to have the budget have some parliamentary effect if it's going to be meaningful. Right now, the budget has zero parliamentary effect because the 60-vote penalty is the 60-vote minimum for appropriations. So we're shooting blanks. We have absolutely no effect here. We are a null factor. And finally, we got to look at revenues. I know it's torture for our Republican friends to look at revenues sometimes, but for crying out loud, we cannot have passion about deficits and then at the same time abandon our passion about deficits as soon as it runs up against the carried interest exception that protects the biggest billionaires on Wall Street. We cannot maintain a passion for deficits that evaporates as soon as it bumps up against tax benefits for big oil, for crying out loud, the companies that need the least tax relief of any companies in the world. And yet, there is this magic disappearing passion about deficits when they bump up against some very obvious ways to raise revenue. Now, we each have our own politics on either side to bring to this, and we can keep ricocheting back and forth from one extreme to the other, But until and unless we have a meaningful bipartisan process that actually looks at tax expenditures and takes a responsible look at what's going on in healthcare so that we can reduce costs without cutting benefits, and looks at revenues and has some parliamentary effect, all we're doing here is noise-making and firing off fireworks into the sky that people look at and think, oh, that must be really interesting. Look what this budget just did. And in fact, everybody who's in on the scheme knows that it has no effect whatsoever, and the appropriators and the leaders are going to get together and make a deal like they just did, and that is how this is going to continue. We have got, Mr. Chairman, to fix our broken budget process, and one of the best things in the recent funding bill that we just passed was to set up a bicameral committee to take a look at how we solve a broken process. The way to a budget that works is the path of bipartisanship. We have to create such a road, and here endeth my statement. Thank you, Chairman. And by the way, I sincerely appreciate your leadership on this particular question. You may not agree with every word that I said, but I think we have common cause in believing that the budget process needs reform and improvement. And I appreciate your leadership in moving us in that direction.